I was watching a Hank Green video about Marvel villains and how these Marvel villains in a lot of movies have legitimate changes to society that would like be a good thing to do. And however, their means are the problem. Like where they're like, we'll take over the whole world and stop the problems of climate change. And then the heroes fight them, and it's not that the villains have bad ideas in regards to the solution, but they have bad ideas on how to get to that solution. The idea is basically a hero can be a villain by how they go about doing the world change. Basically what I got from this is that systemic problems like climate change require systemic solutions. In this case though, I want to talk about world hunger because there was in fact a comic involving Superman trying to fight world hunger. He gave up eventually, even though he was flying around the world delivering food. He found that there was a bunch of resistance from economies that were like, I'm sorry, we can't survive, even you're giving us food, we don't have housing, or other places that legitimately fired weapons at him to say, stop coming here, because they had other dictatorships that were uninterested in the support of a superhuman. And it's interesting because as he eventually gives up, it's like, dude, you could have still helped people. But in the end, he's like, well, if you give a person a fish, they'll eat for a day, and if you teach a person to fish, they'll eat for a lifetime. More on that in a second, because I think it's important to talk about. There is another comic from Superman with the Saturday morning breakfast cereal comedy strip. And basically, they have Superman going through the same idea as this other comic, but as they're going through it, they eventually land that Superman is mostly useful as a power source, just literally cranking a magnet around a copper wire in order to develop electricity, and that ends up being the most effective use of Superman's power. And it's interesting because this kind of idea shows up even in Batman comics. Batman fights crime. And if you play any of the Arkham Asylum games, you'll listen to henchmen talking about how Two-Face got caught, so now I'm just gonna go over and work for the Penguin. And they just bounce around between different gang leaders because that's how they get their funding. Henchmen don't have the skills to just start a new life. So they get into jail, and then they get released from jail, and then they just cycle this way over and over again. There's an interesting political science discussion known as the rational actor theory, and this is something that will help explain why henchmen do what they do. Basically, the henchman doesn't have any skills to become like a baker or to even be like a laborer because it doesn't pay as well because they need to afford housing, health insurance, food. So by going into being a criminal, you have an increase of funding, you already have a community that's supportive, they even have job security. You lose Two-Face, just go over to Penguin. That already exists as a benefit for being in crime. Rational actor theory can be applied to say these people are acting rationally. They just have inputs and outputs that they figure out and that maintains based off their skills. If Batman chose to create a system that allowed henchmen to go into a working class position and eventually move up to higher positions, perhaps, Wayne Enterprises could pay for a school and perhaps even have work programs that are designed for people who are convicts to go and work within Wayne Enterprises in internships that are paid and well paid because, Bruce Wayne had a lot of money and has a lot of financial sway in Gotham City. Going back to the idea of teach a person to fish, crime fighting in society is giving the fish. And teaching and giving people new jobs and lessons is the systemic solution where it allows people to stop doing the crime. You remove the henchmen from working with the gang leaders and suddenly they lose a lot of their power. But an important point to consider about this too is that even when you're providing the fish for people, that's an okay thing too. If Superman continued to provide fish for those hungry people, that would have made it easier for their economies to eventually build up into a situation that can make food for the people on their own, because guess what? They wouldn't have been dying from starvation. That would have been a problem they could have ignored for a while. In the same way that it's look, if you're gonna teach a person to fish, right, they need to learn how to use the pole, then what if it gets cold out in the wild wilderness, right? They're living out there and you might have bears and you gotta learn how to defend yourself against bears. It's a process. It's not a simple thing of just here's your rod, you've learned to fish now, you can eat for your life. It takes time. And that, on top of that, doesn't even talk about the idea of people who are thriving. This is the idea of people just getting to the point where they stop starving. But there's also the fact that people like to thrive. They like to have a life worth living, which is more than simply surviving. So the major thing to take into this is that systemic problems like crime or world hunger require systemic solutions. that, you know, you could be a superhero and you could actually help in those ways by delivering food or by creating systems that allow people to join your giant enterprise and so they can get internships and learn. I mean, even when we look at things that are happening now in the States involving like defunding the police, they always come with other processes to lower crime overall. The goal being that if you have less crime, you have less police. And so it becomes a two-active thing where you lower crime and lower the police situation. And that's what's happening here with the whole fishing thing. It's like, cool, let's teach some people to fish, and that way they won't need to hit up the fish market to steal the fish anymore. They'll be able to do it on their own, but it takes time.